What if the law of attraction isn't just spiritual woo-woo and is actually something that quantum physics might actually support? Today, we're going to be exploring two different interpretations of quantum physics that could explain manifestation. One of them involves consciousness and the other involves parallel realities. We're going to separate the hype from the hard science so that you can understand why these crazy sounding manifestation ideas might be more real than you think. My name's Georgia. I have a master's degree in consciousness, spirituality and transpersonal psychology, and in my free time I love to research manifestation and the science behind shifting your reality. Now, today I'm going to be going through what I believe are the most compelling correlations between manifestation and quantum physics without any of the misconceptions. This is something that deeply fascinates me, so I've done a lot of reading of books and papers by actual quantum physicists, by the way, not by manifestation teachers, to try to really understand the nuance of this. So I've prepared some slides for you that I'm going to put on screen. So by the end of this video, you're going to be an expert in the links between quantum physics and manifestation, and you'll have also deepened your faith in the law of attraction. So first we have to look at the double slit experiment, because this is where all of the mystery and the weirdness stems from. So let's look at the setup of this experiment. So essentially we have a wall that has two slits in, and behind that wall we have a screen. Now we're going to be sending different things through those two slits, and what we're interested in is the pattern that is going to be recorded on the back screen. So we can imagine two different scenarios here. In the first scenario, we're going to be sending particles through the two slits. So we all know what a particle is. It's a tiny little ball of matter. So you can imagine particles like tiny little balls or tiny little bullets. So when we send particles through the two slits, then we expect that each particle is going to go through one of the slits and it's going to hit the screen directly opposite that slit. And so what's going to happen is at the end, when all of these particles have gone through, you're going to end up with two clumps on the screen that are directly opposite the slits. However, we can also send waves through the two slits, and here we get a very different outcome. So you can imagine here a light wave or a water wave. It doesn't really matter what type it is, but basically all waves display a property called diffraction. Now this just means that when a wave goes through a small opening, it spreads out on the other side. So what happens when you send a wave through the two slits is that wave is going to go through both of those two slits, and on the other side it's going to diffract. So after each of the slits it's going to spread out. Now these two spread out waves are going to interfere with each other, so we're going to end up with what's called an interference pattern on the back screen. This is basically the result of the crests and troughs of the wave either adding together and cancelling each other out, so they basically create this striped pattern known as an interference pattern. So what we have to understand here is that we get two very different patterns depending on whether particles are sent through the two slits or waves are sent through the two slits. And these patterns, they make sense. They're what we would expect based on the behaviour of particles and waves. Now the reason the double slit experiment is so interesting is because of what happens when quantum particles are used. So we can think of electrons, for example. So electrons are a subatomic particle that exist around the nucleus within an atom. So they're a type of quantum particle. Now, when we send particles through the two slits, we expect a clump pattern. But what happens when we use quantum particles is that we actually get an interference pattern, which is obviously unexpected because that is what waves produce and we're sending particles through. Now interestingly, we get the interference pattern even when we send the particles through one at a time. So it's not the result of the particles bouncing off of each other or bouncing off of the slits. Something else has to be going on here. Now we don't know why this is happening. Basically, we can't see what's going on when the particles are producing this interference pattern, and the reason for that I will come on to in a minute. But for now, all we know is that in this experiment, quantum particles seem to behave like waves. They produce a pattern that is characteristic of waves. So that's mystery number one, but there is also a second mystery, and this has everything to do with a measuring device. So in this experiment, researchers started using a measuring device to try and figure out what was going on, to try and figure out why the interference pattern was being produced. But as soon as the measuring device is there and a measurement is being taken, something very interesting happens. Suddenly the interference pattern vanishes, and the quantum particles start behaving like actual particles again. They produce the clump pattern that we expected in the first place. So the act of taking a measurement transformed the quantum particle's state and behaviour. Now this is what's known as the observer effect in quantum physics. It's this idea that the act of taking a measurement alters the quantum state. Now note here that observation in physics means measurement. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with a conscious observer. So you might be thinking that it's not immediately clear how any of this relates to manifestation, but I promise you it will become clear. We're actually avoiding a trap here by not claiming that the observer effect proves that consciousness creates reality, because a lot of manifestation teachers do claim that, but in physics, the observer effect is simply about measurement. And where mind comes into this is when we look at the interpretations. And by avoiding this trap, it means that not only are we staying true to the science, but we're also not ruling out a second interpretation that also correlates to manifestation. Now, before we go on to those interpretations, let's just look back at the key points that have emerged from the double slit experiment. So now we know that quantum particles behave differently in different circumstances. When the quantum particles are not being measured, they behave like waves. Now, as I said, we don't know that they actually are waves because as soon as we measure, they stop behaving in this weird way. So we don't know what state they're actually in, but what we do know is that they produce a pattern characteristic of waves. And what we also know is that they behave as if they're in multiple states at once. So if you think about the two slits, for instance, when a wave goes through two slits, it goes through both of those slits at once. Now, the quantum particles are also behaving as if they've gone through both of those slits at once and interfered with themselves to create the interference pattern. So they are behaving as if they are in multiple states at the same time. Now, this phenomenon is known as quantum superposition. Now, physicists use a tool called a wave function to describe all of these possible states. So the wave function, it's a mathematical tool, it's a formula, and it basically gives you all of the different probabilities for finding a particle in a particular state. So it covers all of these different possibilities that the particle could be in. Now, whether the particle is literally in all of these different states or not is up for interpretation. However, there have been other experiments in quantum physics which do suggest that the particle really is in multiple states at the same time. Now, this is really interesting because it suggests that reality is undetermined until it is measured. It exists in a state of multiple possibilities. Now, we also know that when a measurement is taken, the particles start behaving like particles again. In other words, they take on a definite state. So this is in contrast to the undetermined state that a particle seems to exist in when it's in a quantum superposition, when it's not being measured. As soon as a measurement is taken, the particles take on a definite state, like we would expect a particle to have in the first place. Suddenly they have a defined location in space and time. So it's like the wave function of possibilities has collapsed. It's like reality has chosen one path out of the many different options. And this transformation between these two states, the state of quantum superposition and the particle taking on a definite state, is called the collapse of the wave function. So the possibilities described by the wave function collapse into one of those options. So you might be able to see here how this is starting to sound more like manifestation. So think of the wave function like a menu of all possible realities. A measurement, that's like placing your order. But the question is, who does the ordering? Is it the act of taking a measurement? Is it the mind of the researcher who is reading that measurement, or is it something else? The problem is, no one knows why measurement has this effect. This is known as the measurement problem in quantum physics. And this is where manifestation comes in, because there are different interpretations of what's going on here. Now, one of the interpretations can be correlated to the idea that our mind might be able to influence reality, and another of the interpretations correlates to the idea that multiple possible realities might already exist. So let's look at the first interpretation, the one that aligns with this idea that your mind might be able to influence physical reality. So this interpretation is known as the consciousness collapse model, or the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation. And the basic idea of this interpretation is that it is consciousness itself that collapses the wave function. So in other words, it's not the act of taking a measurement or the measuring device that collapses it. It is something to do with the researcher's awareness. So for example, it might be when the reading on the measuring device registers in the researcher's conscious awareness. So in manifestation, this obviously correlates to the idea that you need to hold a clear vision of your desire and saturate your consciousness with that reality until that reality becomes real. We could say, at the very least metaphorically, that this is like this idea of the wave function of possibilities collapsing upon measurement. Now, of course, like any interpretation within quantum physics, there are multiple questions that are raised, so I'm just going to run through a couple of them now for transparency and also because they're interesting. So one of the main questions to emerge from this interpretation is, what would be conscious enough to collapse the wave function? Because it seems unlikely that only humans would be able to collapse the wave function. So could other animals and organisms collapse it? Could a cat collapse the wave function, for example? Or a flea? Or maybe you're a panpsychist who believes that everything has some level of consciousness, and so can a plant collapse the wave function, or even a rock? This is obviously a very valid question, but I do think we have to note here that consciousness itself is still a complete mystery, and so it's unsurprising that we wouldn't know how to answer this question yet. Another question that emerges is, how could reality exist before conscious life? Because of course evolution tells us that conscious life didn't always exist. It emerged at one point in time, but before then the universe of course existed, and so if we assume that consciousness is required to collapse reality into existence, then how could reality exist before conscious life existed to collapse it? Again, very valid question. Now, if you ask someone who is religious or spiritual, this might be more easy for you to find an answer that you are comfortable with, because obviously if you believe in God, or if, like me, you believe there is a fundamental consciousness, then it's easy to see how that could collapse the wave function of reality. If you don't believe in any of those things, then of course this question is going to be very difficult to answer. Another question is whether or not things would exist if no one was observing them. So this microphone, for example, if I and no other conscious being was observing this microphone, would it still exist? Or would it exist in a state of multiple possibilities and not have any definite state until someone like me observes it? You could think of a tree in a really distant forest or a rock on Mars. Would all of these things exist if nothing conscious is around to observe them? Again, if you are spiritual or religious, then you could assume that it is God or the fundamental consciousness that is collapsing these things, and so they always have a definite state. If you don't believe in those things, then this is a very fair question. But by far the biggest question is how? How could consciousness collapse the wave function? So consciousness is this seemingly non-physical thing. Of course, it does correlate to physical processes in the brain, but as I said, consciousness is a mystery, so we don't know if it is produced by the brain or simply correlates to the brain. And the subjective experience of consciousness itself is something that is non-physical. So how could that have a physical effect on reality? Now, there is actually a really interesting model that was put forth by Chalmers and McQueen to propose a potential idea basically about how this could happen. And what they essentially say is that unlike quantum particles which can exist in a state of superposition, they suggest that consciousness itself resists being in a superposition. So in other words, it is always going towards a definite state. And so when consciousness becomes entangled with the quantum system, which just means their states are linked, then basically it forces that quantum system to also collapse into a definite state. Now, if you want to know more about that interpretation, because it is really fascinating, then I did actually make a video about it, so I'll link it up here and I'll also put it in the description box. Now, interestingly, if we assume that the consciousness collapse model is true, then it might help explain why detachment is so important when it comes to manifesting. Now, the reason for this is because there is a phenomenon in quantum physics called a quantum Zeno effect, and this basically means that constant measurement keeps a quantum system frozen in one state. Now, you'll understand how this translates to consciousness in a minute, but for now you just need to understand that the reason this effect happens is because, as we already discussed, the act of taking a measurement collapses the quantum superposition into one state. Now, in order for that quantum system to be able to change and evolve, it has to be able to re-enter a superposition. But because the act of measurement collapses that superposition, if we constantly measure something, then it can't re-enter a superposition. So in other words, it can't evolve or change. It becomes frozen in one state. Now, if we assume that it is consciousness that collapses that superposition, then the same problem would apply. If something is being constantly observed, then that would mean it would become frozen in one place. But the reason this is interesting is because it could help explain detachment. So when it comes to manifestation, we have to detach from our desire. We're allowed to want that desire, but not become too attached to it. Because the problem is, as soon as we become attached to that desire, as soon as we are constantly checking on it, constantly checking back to our reality to see when it's going to come, whether it has come yet, then what's actually happening here is that through the attachment, we keep checking on our current circumstances. We keep affirming the lack of our manifestation. So we can think of this like constant measurement in the quantum Zeno effect. We keep measuring our current circumstances by checking on them and constantly wondering where our manifestation is. And so if we assume this works like the quantum Zeno effect, then maybe we are freezing our current circumstances in place. So our attachment to the outcome that keeps us checking is preventing our current circumstances from changing. So this is why attachment might be really detrimental when it comes to manifestation. This might be why we have to learn to detach, to give our current circumstances the chance to change and evolve and allow our manifestation to come in. Now, if you want to know more about this, then I also made a video about this too, so I'll link that here as well and in the description. So that is the first interpretation that correlates to the law of attraction. The consciousness collapse model suggests that consciousness itself might be able to influence reality at the quantum level. So maybe, if this is true, your mind, your consciousness, can somehow select one possibility out of the many possibilities and collapse that into reality. Now let's look at the second interpretation that correlates to manifestation. Now this one is all about the idea that all possible realities might already exist. So this is the many worlds interpretation in quantum physics. And this is an interpretation that we would have missed if we had assumed, like many manifestation teachers do, that our consciousness collapses all of the possibilities. Now, to understand this one, again, we need to understand quantum superposition. The idea that quantum particles exist in an undetermined state, or they behave as if they're in multiple states at once, until they are measured, or until they are observed if we assume the other interpretation to be correct. So we know that all of these possibilities are described by the wave function. However, instead of assuming that they all collapse into one of the possibilities, the many worlds interpretation assumes that upon measurement, each different possibility described by the wave function branches into a separate universe. So in other words, each possibility is realized in a different parallel reality. So maybe there's a version of you out there in a parallel reality that already has the things that you're trying to manifest. And so maybe the law of attraction is simply about you aligning to that version and you shifting into that parallel reality. So you can see how the idea of quantum jumping makes a lot of sense in the context of the many worlds interpretation. You don't need to create that reality that you want to manifest. Instead, you just need to learn how to shift into it or jump into that parallel reality. Now, of course, the many worlds interpretation itself doesn't suggest that we can intentionally jump between these realities. It also doesn't exist that there is an infinite number of realities because the number is actually constrained by the wave function. But what it does suggest is that there might be different versions of you that do exist simultaneously. And by the way, the many worlds interpretation is a very popular interpretation of quantum physics. Obviously not the law of attraction bits that I'm correlating to it, but the idea of parallel realities is a well-regarded idea within quantum physics. So here we have two different interpretations, both of which were created by actual quantum physicists, which highly correlate to certain ideas within manifestation. So now I just want to cover three key takeaways that we can learn from all of these different crazy ideas within quantum physics. So the first key takeaway is that reality at the fundamental level is undetermined until it is interacted with in some way. Multiple possibilities exist until one is selected. Now, the second key takeaway is that one interpretation suggests that consciousness itself could be what causes one of the possibilities to be selected. And finally, the third key takeaway is that another interpretation suggests that all possibilities become realized in parallel realities. So all of these ideas in manifestation, which seem very woo-woo, have at least some grounding in quantum physics, even if it doesn't prove anything. Whether you believe in shifting timelines or collapsing one outcome through your focus, these interpretations provide very powerful metaphors at the very least, if not more. So let me know in the comments, do you believe that either of these interpretations are the mechanism behind manifestation? Which one of them resonates with you the most? Now, if you want to go even deeper into this, then I would suggest you watch the video I mentioned where I discussed Chalmers and McQueen's model about how consciousness itself could collapse the wave function. So if you want to see that, you can watch this video here. If for now you've had enough of quantum physics and you want a scientifically backed manifestation process that doesn't rely on quantum physics, then you can watch this video here. For now, thank you so much for watching. Please give this video a thumbs up if you found it interesting, and I hope to see you in the next one.